Okay, this topic is ventilation rates in outpatient spaces. And we want to hit this topic because there's been some talk in the industry right now in California, and it came up on a project that we had in Northern California very recently. So what we want to do is let you know what Kaiser Standards say, what the code conversation is and has been, and how to approach this issue if it comes up in your projects. So basically, for the last 30 years, there's been two ways that we've done HVAC design in outpatient facilities. One I'll call the air change per hour method, or you could call it the FGI way, and that is that a designer would follow the table of air change rates from FGI, or what is now ASHRAE Standard 170, or in California we call this Table 4A of the Mechanical Code. The other way I'll call the Energy Code method. So in California, this means using Title 24, and outside California, we'd be talking about using an IEC Energy Code or ASHRAE 90.1. And a B occupancy medical office building is going to comply very much the same as an office building. So it's important to understand the comparison between the two. If you look at just your standard exam room using the air change method, you'd have these 2 air changes of outside air, 4 to 6 air changes of total air, and those are mandatory minimums, so you use them all the time. And then using the energy code, we would supply the room with air just basically according to its need. So we design the system for a maximum of 4 or 6 air changes, but the minimum is less than a half an air change or about an air change. And about 2/3, 3/4 of the time, it rides right down there at the low end. When we look at the trends from our control systems, the real need for air in exam rooms is more like 1 air change or 1.5 air changes most of the time. And so then energy under these two methods, the air change method and this energy code method are mutually exclusive. If you're going to design a building using the air change method, you need to ignore or have exceptions to the energy efficiency requirements for variable air systems. And conversely, if you're going to design a building for energy efficiency and variable air, you cannot or will not meet the mandatory minimum air change rates, right? So the air changes method uses a lot more energy. And so Kaiser standards say to favor the energy method. And this has actually been our standard for a while. I started in 2011. This predates me. And I'm not going to pretend that there was a great reason for it, before my time. It's just that it's cheaper to build medical office buildings using the energy code method. You do return plenums and standard rooftop units, etc. Under the air change rules, you get bigger systems, and sometimes you duct the returns. You have these pressure relationships to worry about. So it's just more money. So KP has and owns MOBs that were designed using air changes. They're pretty easy to spot, at least for me. You just look at the energy bills and you look for the ones with double the energy, and boom, there they are. And so when we overhauled the standards in 2012, we made this very explicit. We say do not use air changes unless you really need to, like by law. And that's what it says now. So 2017 version of KP standards is the same as 2012. Don't use air change method unless you actually need to. Because I should mention, there's no actual known benefit to the air changes. The occupants of the buildings don't know the difference. There's no clinical implications. Obviously, there are folks at ASHRAE or FGI who say, well, you should use air changes, but even they can't articulate why or any benefit that's associated with it. And if you're doing Kaiser work, obviously, the energy targets that we have in our program are fairly aggressive, and we assume that you're not going to use air changes. There are some exceptions throughout the buildings, OR suites and scope cleaning and 797 pharmacies, isolation spaces. KP standards do call for more air there. But for most of the spaces in MOBs, exam rooms, waiting rooms, treatment rooms, things like that, we say don't do it, and you flat out won't meet our energy targets if you do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause there. I am going to talk about the actual code discussion that we had in California, but before I do, let me stop there and ask if there's any questions on Kaiser standards and its intent. Okay, so now let me show you the conversation as it relates to the California code. And unfortunately, this could be a state by state or AHJ by AHJ conversation that could need to get repeated a number of times. There's a recent set of supplements to the California Mechanical Code. It goes into effect next week, and that includes a line that says follow this code and ASHRAE 170 for healthcare facilities, which seems to say that, hey, listen, for any healthcare building, including the smallest outpatient clinic, you need to use full-blown hospital air conditioning, air changes and pressures and two-pass filtration, the whole deal. And so we had a project team in Northern California where the design engineer saw this in the code and said, well, obviously we need to follow it. And so here's what that means. We need to pull out and replace some fairly new HVAC equipment because we have to put in bigger units. We're going to need to add some return ducts and controls to meet some of the pressure requirements. We need to plan on about double the energy consumption as an operating cost. And we would actually need to write a variance from the AHJ to exempt us from following the energy code. And so Scott and I reached out to the state, both OSHPD and the Energy Commission, and said, you know, hey, was it really the intent here to add a bunch of air and a bunch of energy to our medical office buildings? And the answer we got back was that a healthcare building in California refers only to buildings that are covered by OSHPD. So everything outside of that jurisdictional line, we would keep doing what we're doing, right? And so in the memo that we sent last week prior to this call, you can read all the details of that, the correspondence that we have in the state. So if you're in California and this comes up, we have a pretty good handle on this. If you're a design engineer, well-intentioned, I should say, if he thinks he's doing the right thing by adding air or upsizing units, let us know right away. We can do some education and get through that. If you're outside California, that's to let us know at the program office right away. We'll do education, we'll talk through it. If it's coming from a state or an AHJ, I would want to know that personally, and we're going to want to talk to that state. We'll want to file variances and basically defend our design program against those as new requirements. I will say, unfortunately, that the code writing groups are not a ton of help here. ASHRAE in particular, Kaiser brought this issue to ASHRAE fairly loudly, I would say, in 2014, 2015, and we would hope they would do something prior to the 2018 FGI publications. Unfortunately, they went completely the other way. They published air change tables for all building types over quite a few objections, public comments and appeals and that sort of thing. The 2018 FGI book did publish some very helpful language. So currently the FGI guidelines acknowledge that air changes are not right for everywhere, but ASHRAE as of yet does not. ASHRAE has some working groups that are talking about the problem, but they could be years away from doing anything different. From the conversation in California and our involvement in the national level, I will say this. There has not been any campaign or deliberate effort to add new requirements to medical office buildings. It's not like somebody came around and said, hey, medical office buildings aren't using enough energy, let's change the code so that they use more. Or, hey, medical office buildings aren't using enough air, let's change the code so that they use more. That conversation never happened. It never happened in the industry. It hasn't happened in the last 10 years. So our position is that basically if states are adopting this, and in the manner that they're adopting this, it essentially creates an unintended increase. That they're sort of accidentally adopting hospital-grade HVAC standards into spaces where it's really not appropriate. And so we do want to step in and push back on that in the correct and respectful way. And so we do need you to get us involved in any case where you think that's happening.